Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today because this is a topic that for me was one of the reasons why I got into human resources in the first place. I wanted to make sure, based on my own employment experience when I was really early in my career, that what happened to me, which wasn't heavy duty, but wasn't very comfortable either, wouldn't happen to anyone else. And from what I could tell, the best vantage point to sit in to make sure that that wouldn't be present for others was in the HR position. And this is a pretty big topic. And the approach I'm going to take with respect to it is around using a live example, because I know for myself it's a lot easier to figure out the ins and outs of something when you can see it actually working. So to get us started, I'd like to start with a mental health snapshot. And this is information that anyone has access to on the Canadian Mental Health Association website. And this reinforces some of the statistics that Russ talked about earlier, but it does directly affect all Canadians. We saw that in the room this afternoon when we all put up our hand because we were either directly or indirectly impacted by someone who has a mental illness. And mental illness is a very indiscriminate concern. It doesn't care how old you are. It doesn't care where you were born. It doesn't care whether or not you're ready for it. It just shows up in many cases. If we look at the major causes of things from a mental health perspective that affect us as HR practitioners in the workforce, depression is certainly one of them. And depression presents itself in many wondrous and various ways. And we also have bipolar disorder, which can also be a component of depression. And these are just a few of the types of concerns that we are looking at when we choose to employ people. So in order to make sure that we have a better grip on the issue, I'm going to introduce you to Pat. So this is Pat. And Pat works in an organization where you are the HR professional responsible for all of the employees. You're working in a really great company. And you don't really have too many complaints coming into your office. Things are pretty good. You've worked with this group for a few months now, and in May, this month, your time is invested in getting the annual performance review cycle closed. You've made presentations to managers and staff members to review the process and get everyone underway on completing the final performance reviews. One of the key things that you've highlighted to managers were the top 5 performance management concerns and challenges that face this process. Number 1, it's a manual and time-consuming process we do once a year. Number 2, there's no integration or alignment with what the organization is actually doing. Number 3, limited feedback, development, and coaching for the employees. Number 4, performance reviews are reactive, not proactive. Number 5, here we go, incentives and rewards are based on reviews cause issues around fairness. So we know these things can happen with performance management, and definitely performance management causes a measure of stress on organizations, on managers, and on employees. So, right on target, Pat's manager comes to speak to you. Pat's manager is concerned about Pat's performance. It's never been great, but some of that could be because Pat was new and learning. But for this review period, the manager needs to help Pat see the impacts of less than best performance. You check the records, and Pat's been working with this manager for the past 4 years, and then spent 2 years with a different manager before that. So Pat's been with the organization for 6 years. Good grief, how long has less than best performance been tolerated in this employee? So we've got a winner on number 4. Our performance review is going to be reactive, not proactive. And the manager has come to you because the wording in this performance review needs to be balanced yet meaningful. There have been layoffs in the past, and the manager wants to ensure Pat understands that an increase in performance is due. The manager's trying to do this from a good place. The manager's concerned Pat may end up on a list for layoffs in the future. But you, the HR practitioner that you are, suggest that this is the first time Pat will be hearing this type of message, and it might be best to create a structured work plan with checkpoints and clearly articulated resources to create support and help, so both Pat and the manager get where they want to go together. The manager feels it might be too soon for that and wants to see how the review goes over first. So, as Russ had identified, most employees aren't going to walk up to you and say, I have a mental health concern. In fact, in my experience, I've had a really hard time getting them to come up to me and say, I have a health concern. I've walked into employees in the hallways with casts on their legs, and I go, that's new. Anything we can help you with? No, I just did it in hockey, it'll be fine. So this is something that we're very reliant as HR practitioners, as business owners, on the line managers to be able to help us manage and identify. And around performance management time, we're even more reliant on them. So as I'm going through my presentation today, you'll notice my little bouncing triangle to help you identify from start to finish how long this concern could feasibly take in real life. So your organization has a policy outlining the steps in performance management and what potential outcomes might be, including structured work plans or a full performance improvement process. You suspect the manager has not used a work plan before as a tool and is looking at it less as support and more as a big stick. But the manager's worked with Pat for a while now and should be in the best position to make this call, so you let it go. You're a busy HR practitioner. A few weeks later, you check in with the manager to see how the conversation went. The manager said it went fine. But Pat didn't seem overly affected by it, which was surprising. The manager does not have the signed review back yet, so there's hope that further conversations can happen. So when you're doing a check-in, you need to make sure that even at this stage in the game, before any problems arise, that you've got policies being followed consistently. And you need to be the champion for that. As HR, we're well aware of the fact that what we do, what we say, what we model is going to be followed, we hope. But we also need to make sure that everyone around us in leadership is also on page with that. We also need to make sure that the policies are accessible and that they're understandable, which may mean putting them in many different languages. They also should be very clear and hopefully concise so that nothing is left to interpretation. Pat's performance review, along with many others, comes back signed and you file it away without another thought. So, not a surprise, all of the performance reviews come back signed for the most part. I know in my career occasionally I have one or two holdouts, but it's usually because they don't like the language in the little acknowledgement section. And once we get past that, we're off and running. But it is an organization's responsibility to ensure they have accurate and up-to-date policies. This is not typically where you see an organization get really excited about making an investment. When you know how much it's going to cost to get oversight by a legal professional or even an outside HR professional, and you talk about this with the people who are holding the purse strings, they're probably looking at you and going, and why are we doing this? Explain again how this is going to help. At least that's a conversation I get quite often. But if your policies get reviewed on a proactive basis, it costs a lot less to keep them updated and benchmarked. Proper oversight and scrutiny are really, really important because you need to be able to ensure, again, that those policies can be read and understood by anyone and that they've also been looked at objectively, because I also have read a number of policies over the years that were not particularly objective. They were written very much from the point of view of thou shalt, and then don't ask me any questions. And that's not a great position to be in. So in this particular case, we're going to get a great big surprise. So in this case, the big surprise manifests itself in an employee from Pat's group with whom you have a good working relationship, asks to speak to you in confidence. This employee has approached you to see if you're aware that within the group there is now a very serious rumor that Pat has been inappropriately approached by someone at work. You've not heard this, you thank the employee, you confirm their anonymity at this point in the process, and you ask them to hold this information in confidence and not share it any further until they've spoken to you. You were going to leave on time today, but instead you make arrangements to speak to Pat, who luckily is still at work. You're not sure how Pat may be feeling, so you're not surprised when Pat states immediate availability and comes to speak to you in your office. When questioned, Pat calmly and without emotion tells you that there was an incident of inappropriate touching between Pat and the manager. You ask if Pat is comfortable sharing more details and ask permission to take confidential notes, handwritten notes, to Russ's point. Pat says yes and continues telling you that after a team meeting 4 weeks ago in one of the boardrooms, Pat and the manager were the only two left. Pat then explains the manager touched Pat in an inappropriate way and place. No one else saw the incident. The door to the boardroom had swung closed behind the last employee who left, and there were no windows into this room. Pat goes on to say that it was not surprising, as the manager had been paying more attention than usual to Pat in the last few weeks. You ask how Pat is feeling. Pat's not happy about the incident, but seems calm and matter-of-fact about things. You ask if Pat would like to have arrangements made to work in another location away from the manager. Pat says, no, it's fine. You ask Pat why you were not brought into this sooner, because you're there for the welfare of the employees. Pat doesn't have an answer for you. This confuses you. But then you've never been in Pat's shoes before, luckily, so you let it go. It's the end of the day, and you encourage Pat to go home. Pat gets up and states that there's still a lot of work to do and plans to go back to do it. So here we go. Keep calm and follow your policies. Hopefully you've got a really good one, and if not, call Russ. So, you know you have a harassment and discrimination policy that outlines what to do in the event an allegation is made. You even have the HR manual to walk you through next steps. You sign and date your notes, and over the next few days, you work towards understanding the concerns the employee brought forward. In one particularly emotional meeting, you help the manager to whom the allegations have been brought against to understand that a complaint has been brought forward, but for now, maintain the confidentiality of the employee. You know the full details will need to be explored and investigated in time. The manager is completely horrified. But because of the training that's taken place in your organization, quickly the manager realizes what has to happen next and understands clearly what the steps are in the harassment and discrimination policy. So you are grateful that the manager knows what will take place next, and you make time to see the president of the organization as you need to access resources. You meet with the president, and without giving out too many details, you spell out what it is you need. This is hard. The president wants to know exactly what is going on. And they usually say it kind of like that, in my experience. But the president also recognizes that this information needs to be contained and is confidential to the parties that it impacts. So after getting over the initial shock, is in listening mode. In this case, you're advocating that a third neutral party comes in to do the investigation. Pat may have some issues that need attention, given everything that's happened. You are especially concerned by the fact that now 3 other employees have confidentially come forward to tell you about Pat's concerns, because Pat has shared the concern with them. None of them believe the manager would have been capable of doing this. They feel Pat is acting oddly. You've spoken to Pat twice more about the incident, both at Pat's request, and both times you've requested Pat's discretion and asked that the incident not be spoken of to others and to allow an investigation to take place without any interference. You feel a behavioral psychologist experienced in these types of investigations would be the best option to conduct the investigation. You are given the green light by the president and $3,000 to get it done as soon as possible. The interesting thing is most organizations don't have a contingency fund for these types of occurrences, and it's something to think about. The other part of this is bringing forward what Russ had mentioned around compassion. While the president in this case wasn't particularly happy about hearing something of this magnitude's happening, did express a measure of compassion in not poking any further into it. And that sometimes can be fairly rare as well, because a lot of emotions get packed into this, don't they? Especially for people when they're in an ownership position. And we need to, as HR practitioners, manage their needs as well. So top down, across, bottom up, we're at the center, and we need to make sure that we're looking after this in a compassionate way for everyone. So our performance reviews took place in May. We're now at August. You've located a behavioral psychologist with the background you need from a well-known local provider of these types of services. You've provided the behavioral psychologist with a copy of your policy, and you coordinate what it is that this person needs. There's a full list of employees who have interacted with the two principal people directly before and after the alleged incident. They all need to be spoken with. You let Pat and the manager know separately what investigative steps will take place and the time frames. You let them both know what the process entails and why. You make arrangements. You bring each staff member listed in one by one to speak to you, to go over the policy, the investigative procedure, their role in the investigation. You remind them about confidentiality, and that if this type of concern ever arose for them, the organization would stand behind them and follow the same steps. Everyone's needs are respected in the process. If there are any follow-on concerns, your door is open, and they should come and speak to you. There are 18 people in total that the investigator needs to speak to, and as things get underway, a further 3 names are added to the list by Pat. All people Pat has chosen to share the allegation with, but who have no direct bearing on the concern as they were from different departments. Some of them weren't even present the day of the concern. The investigator starts with Pat, then the manager, and works from there. It takes a few weeks to get through everyone. The behavioral psychologist has her report ready, and she sits down with you to share it. She begins by stating that it's her belief the allegations of inappropriate touching cannot be substantiated. There is no indication that this was the result of an escalation of interactions, nor was this behavior typical of the manager. In fact, it's distinctly out of character. Yes, there's always the concern of an isolated incident, but given the work history of the manager, she's confident in saying that whatever happened in that room was either misconstrued by Pat or fabricated. Furthermore, the behavioral psychologist goes on to say that Pat does truly believe the incident happened, but was displaying incongruent reactions for someone who had been touched inappropriately by someone they should be trusting and respecting. The psychologist believes Pat has a form of mental illness that is currently untreated and recommends that the employer encourage Pat to seek the care of a physician or a psychologist to receive care. And she gives you her full written report. So we've got some lovely statistics here, again from the Canadian Mental Health Association. 49% of people who have suffered from something, a form of mental illness, depression, anxiety, have not sought care. This is very typical in our society. And there is also a great causal link between stress and mental illness. And it can really bring a lot of pressure to bear on someone who's already finding it difficult to deal with things day to day. Potentially that's what we're seeing with Pat. So to recap, there are no actions pending against the manager, but Pat believes the incident took place. Furthermore, Pat's in need of help from a qualified medical practitioner. You set up a meeting with Pat where you speak to the findings regarding the incident and specifically around the incident itself. Pat is incensed and now acting a bit more in line with what you would have expected from the start. But now you are aware this presents a very new problem. Very carefully, you explain to Pat that you know Pat firmly believes the incident took place and that this is a very heavy burden to carry. You encourage Pat to use the benefits plan to see a professional. You even go so far as to give Pat the website to locate a general practitioner who's taking on new clients, as Pat has identified there's no family doctor. You also explain what will happen next with respect to the results of the investigation and reiterate the importance of keeping the information confidential for everyone concerned. You follow through on the investigative procedure, closing off the communication with the impacted parties, and truly hope things will start to quiet down. The manager is relieved, but still concerned because Pat has no remedy. The manager is also concerned that the feedback Pat received at the annual review may have started all of this. Certainly, it was the reason the manager had been spending more time with Pat to help foster increased performance. The manager is concerned that what was supposed to be an act of support has now turned into something quite different. You wonder if things would be different if you'd insisted in a structured work plan to contextualize the additional attention for Pat, or if the outcome would have been the same either way. This is a huge conundrum for employers to be in, and I'd love to tell you this will be the last time we hear about concerns like this in the workplace, because we're in a very stuck spot, aren't we? Pat doesn't have a remedy at all. So this is a huge conundrum for employers, and it's not an easy outcome. When there is behavior present you need to address, you can't just let it go. You need to find another way to help both the employee, to your point, their peers, and anyone else impacted through this circumstance. So while you were hoping it was going to quiet down, chances are you've got a lot more work to do. Get to go back to your policy manual. Because the next morning, you find Pat at your door. Pat has had further conversations at home, and Pat's family is rallying. They want Pat to go to the police and file a police report. There's nothing you can do to stop that. You checked with your lawyer. You discourage it by stating at some point the investigative report the organization completed on the incident would come into play with the police, and that the organization is doing everything in its power to respectfully handle the situation, supporting Pat and all of the people involved. You check to see if Pat did go to the website to find a new family doctor or had called the 1-800 number for the Employee and Family Assistance Program. Pat had done neither. In the intervening weeks, Pat continues to tell other employees about the incident in a way that makes it look like the organization has not addressed the concern. However, based on the likability of the manager and the number of people involved in the investigation, this quickly turns into Pat becoming isolated as employees practice avoidance to circumvent any further awkward conversation. The traffic to your door has been steady, and the employees range from angry that Pat is allowed to continually smear this manager's reputation at work to concern for both Pat and the manager. Pat continues to come to your office, sometimes to rehash the complaint, and sometimes at your request to ask Pat to cease and desist in making the allegations. You work to help Pat see how this is not serving the end result that Pat is looking for. At one point, Pat comes in to speak to you, laptop open and running. You feel compelled to tell Pat that any recordings made without your knowledge or express consent are unusable. Pat closes the laptop. The manager, as you can imagine, is not faring very well. Devastated by the allegations and devastated that Pat is quickly spooling out of the organization's reach in terms of being able to help, The manager is looking tired and unhappy. The manager's manager is frequently in your office asking to shut down the rumors and allegations. All of this was investigated and needs to be put behind us. You state you're doing what can be done, but are fast running out of options since Pat's not accessing help. Luckily for you, the parts of the organization that are aware of the concern are handling this maturely, ceasing to engage Pat either negatively or positively, and treating the manager as they normally would. So we're really stuck again, or even more stuck than we were before. And the next place you need to go is back into your policy manual. Clear and transparent processes are really key. But when you go and engage one, it should never be a surprise to the people who are being impacted that you've engaged that particular policy, nor what they should expect from the policy, because the policy should be looking after the interests of everyone. That's where the clear and transparent process comes in. Healthy workplace practices need to be exemplified by employers. You guys set the tone, you set the example. In this particular case, your mettle is being well tested. But it's being tested for very good reason. Employees do not come forward and say, I have a mental illness. In many cases, they don't realize that that's in fact what's at play. We hear a lot of language around, I'm really stressed. I'm really tired. I didn't really feel it coming into work today. None of those things mean someone has a mental illness. They may have an iron deficiency as well. But those are signs when they're consistently present that we need to pay attention to, because stigma is huge in North America. And we need to make sure we're aware of that. Getting back to our example, you are out of options and need assistance in next steps with Pat. Pat's still concerned with the way the organization's handled the whole situation and now is more and more unreachable, but still stuck on the issue. Pat is also not accessing outside help, and you suspect that family at home are not helping. Instead, they're egging Pat on. You recognize that this is not typical behavior, yet all your requests and support to engage Pat with the resources needed have come to nothing. Where Pat's performance wasn't strong before, it has now completely deteriorated. Yet Pat continues to put in heroic hours of work. Coworkers state that Pat sits in the office and seems distant, not really working on anything, but not goofing off either. Things cannot go on like this. You make another request to the president to fund outside help, this time legal counsel. Legal counsel looks at the timeline, chain of events, and documentation associated with the file. There's only one option, and that is to put Pat on a performance improvement plan. One Pat cannot even hope to pass unless help is accessed. The assumption here is that this may be a final wake-up call to help Pat see that what's being put at risk is employment, not because the employer isn't supporting Pat's need for help or communicating or even creating an accommodation where needed, but because Pat isn't engaging. You're not happy with taking a remedial action in this case, but you can't see any other options either. You and the manager put Pat on a 90-day performance improvement plan specific to 3 of the job duties that Pat is failing in. After it's delivered to Pat, the amount of activity dies down completely. At the very least, it stopped Pat from spreading any more misinformation because of a renewed focus at work. So if you look at the timeline here as well, you'll see that we've gone a long way from May, we're now mid-November. It's been quite some time that you've been putting a lot of effort into this and engaging resources like legal and investigators. So Pat almost failed the performance improvement program. We knew that that would be an outcome. But in the end, it was the wake-up call that it was intended to be. Pat sought a doctor's note and was placed on short-term disability. Had it not been for regular meetings set up with you and the manager both present, outlining clear outcomes if things remained unchanged, and coupled with non-judgmental offerings of support to the Employee Assistance Program and the benefits plan, you're not sure Pat would have finally figured out the company would have had no choice but to terminate based on performance. You are not happy about what road it took to get here, nor how long, but it was the right outcome for Pat. So I know in my experience, a lot of the employees are concerned about accessing the Employee Assistance Program because they feel potentially we get a log. We know who called, when they called, and what they called about. It always amazes me how much time employees think we have because, you know, we're going to read all that. No. So it's important that when you're doing training, when you're having your benefits broker come in, when you're having your benefits plan provider come in to speak to employees, you really push the confidentiality side of things and help them to understand not only do we not have time to look through all that, we don't even have access to it. And this is where Pipetta, if you will recall, Russ's absolute favorite piece of legislation, does come into play in favor of the employees, because since they put that in, we can see nothing. And that's as it should be. We get a lovely bill every month. That's it. And we get a usage report, but it's non-specific. So these are things you need to help the employees to take a look at. In one extreme case at a small tech company that I worked at, I actually had employees who were concerned come in to take a look at our billing so they could see exactly what we saw. And that seemed to assuage a few concerns and complaints. So what happened next? For the Pats of the world, it's really important that employers understand and know what to do when something is amiss that best is addressed by a qualified healthcare practitioner. This requires diligence and in some cases a financial investment on the part of the company. However, often our hands are tied. As employers, we can only do so much. This case could go either way from this point. Pat could return to the workplace under an accommodation plan, allowing Pat to resume work. But this is not an easy path either for Pat or for the workplace. There's a lot that's gone on here. People have long memories. It's going to be a lot of work when Pat gets back. Pat also may feel that coming back is not an option or that it's poison and just can't face it. Pat could also progress to long-term disability and, unable to remain employed in that particular occupation, would then be released from the organization at a suitable time, coordinated through the benefit company and the employer. Outcomes in this scenario are many and varied, but all of them require further diligence, follow-up, to ensure that the right actions are taking place for the right reasons. As Russ mentioned, these concerns can be short-term, they can be long-term, or they can be chronic. We don't know how these stories will end. So there is a cost associated with this. Mental health concerns in the workplace do require a considerable amount of attention, time, and investment to handle them appropriately. But as Russ pointed out, it's better than a wrongful dismissal suit, a human rights complaint, or a poisoned work environment. There are ways you can mitigate these costs. I don't know how many times you guys have had to have this lovely discussion with the law firm, but I love having it. It's one of my favorites. Hi, we need to reduce your bill. We're about to go into very expensive engagement, and I'm wondering whether or not we can draw upon some other resources beyond your wonderful, capable self. Can we use any of your articling students instead? Because they bill out at a much lower rate. Can we apportion the work so that we get low-value work done at low-value dollar, high-value work done at high-value dollar? You can also talk to your legal service providers around things like expenses. Oftentimes there's costs associated with photocopying and things of that nature. You can talk to them. If you're not willing to have these conversations with your providers and work collaboratively towards it, things can get really tough. You're going to end up with a humongous bill, and or you might actually even start feeling resentment towards the provider. So it's important to make sure you have these dialogues in place, and I've never yet had a negative outcome from one of those conversations. They don't enjoy it, but they always come to the table with something. So in this example, things went as smoothly as possible for a mental health concern at work. It took a year. That's actually pretty short. As an employer, you have fiduciary responsibilities to support and facilitate responsible workplace practices for all employees in these circumstances. Do you know what they are? So Russ and I have talked about many of them today. So there's some things that you can do to make sure you're ready. You can make sure that you review and update your corporate policies and invest in third-party oversight, like a legal professional specializing in employment law. And make sure your employment contracts and other documents, like your written warning letters, your termination letters, are also up to date. That morality clause, they need to resonate and relate to each other. And you need to have human resource expertise on hand, but I'm preaching to the choir here on that one. You also hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. You need to help an organization understand how much budget they should be putting aside for incidental expenses, like legal fees, so you can access valuable services when you need them. But this is also the case for individuals who are coming in with new disabilities, who require accommodation. Life circumstances are happening all around us, and so we need to be ready to meet them. And not tell the employee, well, we'd love to be able to put that ramp in for your new wheelchair, but we can't afford that till next fiscal year. That doesn't work. You also should invest in employee and family assistance programs as part of your group insurance benefits. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of my all-time best investments every time I've encouraged an employer to take one on. The other great part about that is that you can often get the benefits company to come in and do workshops for you, sometimes for free. And those workshops can be based around mental health if that's the need. You also need to make sure you're educating your management and staff and that you have your policies signed off no less than once a year. Key policies like harassment and discrimination in Ontario require further training to be legislatively compliant. So it just makes good sense to provide periodic training to support consistency in the application, especially around things like performance management. And you need to make sure everyone knows how to access their group insurance benefits and the confidentiality when using their services. But we can go even further than this. And this is a call to action for the room. We can build awareness. Mental health has a huge stigma attached to it. Use the resources available to you through your local associations, through educators, and through your own benefits plan to reduce this stigma. Support a local charity focused on mental health as a way to provide education and awareness both for your own staff and for the community at large. Make mental health a part of your office wellness program. Find an internal champion to keep the organization and its employees mindful about their own mental health. Remind staff that mental health concerns are treatable, enabling healthy lives at work and at home. Put in place healthy workplace practices around and policies. Consider one for your organization. You can involve your joint health and safety committee, and you can use it as a platform for workplace anti-bullying and to provide resources for self-diagnosis for stress and other common signs of overwork, which is usually a precursor if it continues unabated. All of these things sound really great, don't they? These are some of the resources you can use to be able to put these practices in place in your organization. So that concludes my presentation today. I'd love to open the floor to any questions, concerns.